Yeah, so let's start. So first of all, thank you everybody for joining us from different countries and regions on the globe. The days are difficult, but they're also making some things very easy and accessible to us, and they make us come together in very different circumstances and in a very lovely way, in a sense. So welcome to another session of Methods in Sinology. This is a lecture series that was organized by Maddalena Poli and Mariana Zorkina, and I would like, first of all, to thank the organizers for organizing this wonderful series of lectures, including the two sessions that we will hear today and next week, the same time, which deal with methodologies for reading and approaching historiographical research. My name is Avital Rom. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Freeburg Center for East Asian Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I will chair the session today. Our speaker today, which is the important part, and next week, is Dr. Heng, who is an assistant professor in the Faculty of East Asian Studies at the University of Arizona. Heng is a book historian specializing in the study of early China. She earned her PhD in Chinese history from Harvard University after receiving her MA in Chinese literature from the University of Colorado at Boulder and a BA in classics and comparative literature at Cornell University. Heng has done some fascinating work on paratextual devices in the early Chinese literary tradition. Like I said, I warmly recommend reading her works. Her most recent article, published in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, suggests a new way of reading the Jing sections of Han Fei's Chu Shuo chapters as paratextual tools, which mediate between the textual producers and the readers or users of the text. Her current book project, titled Paratext and the Transformation of Early Chinese Writings, expands the concept of paratext to locate the reductional intentions of the nameless thinkers and compilers involved in manuscript production. She's also interested in the comparative study of book cultures in the ancient world, and is currently working on a Chinese translation of Ovid's Fasti Book 6. In her presentations today and next week, Professor Du will explore two methodological propositions associated with the linguistic turn as possible ways to reestablish relationships between word and deed, between text and time. Today's talk is titled Reading Historiography as Speech Acts. Please join me in welcoming Heng Du.
Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much to Avital for such a kind introduction. And I also want to thank Maddalena and Mariana for organizing this wonderful initiative. I'm very much looking forward to being able to explore all the lectures and resources they've made available over summer break. I also want to thank everyone who's here. I know this is lunch and dinner time, depending on where you are on Earth. And also, I know there's a very exciting conference that's at the moment going on. So I very much hope I won't be wasting your time today. So I'll try my best. So I guess I'll share my slides now. Okay, let's see, over here. Can you all see this okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, so the two talks that we're going to do this week, next week, centered around this linguistic turn as a source of historical research, source of methodology for historical research. Okay, how do I turn the slides now? Okay, so I will start today with a hopefully brief meta history discussion, right? So on methodology, And this serves as the introduction to both of the lectures. So I'll start by just briefly let us think about all the sub-disciplines of history, at least in the sort of Anglo-American context. And that serves as a way of me introducing myself disciplinarily. And then we'll quickly touch upon what I think of as this central question that ties together the two lectures, namely word versus deed. And the case study for today is centered around this biography in what's often thought of as the earliest authored historiographical work in the Chinese tradition, right? In the records of the grand historian or Shiji. But we're focusing on this basically one single story on Sun Wu, and then we'll do a very quick conclusion. So, as Avital mentioned, I usually define myself as a book historian, specializing in the study of early China. So I thought I'd briefly talk about what book history is and how we relate to these other sub-disciplines of history. So if we think about the sort of overview of history development of historical research in the Western context, in the post-war period, right? So in this huge generalizing terms, right? It starts with the rise of social history, which is a reaction to perhaps a more traditional form of historical research that focuses on the great men, right? And so the rise of social history that took place during the 60s and 70s. And then in the 80s and 90s, what we see is both a return of interest in what we might think of as meaning and representation. So that's associated with what we think of as postmodernism or post-structuralism, as well as this other closely imbricated concept, the linguistic turn. And then we also see sort of the broadening of the scope of the historical research, right? This is when women's history and the history of gender and sexuality became important, as well as the study of non-elite culture, constituting a very important part of cultural history. So in some ways, the way I see book history is that it's something that ties together a lot of these development, right? So I think the reason why I pick the term book history as opposed to say manuscript studies is, partly it just happened to be what my personal training, the history of my personal training has been, but I think there is this slight difference in emphasis. So for book historians today, it is very much about thinking about textual objects, and that could be a manuscript, a physical book, but it could also be some kind of a digital file. So thinking about this textual object as a interface between the world inside and outside of text, right? So specifically between text and its social context. So as you can see, then book history in a lot of ways ties together these two phases in the post-war development of history, and it has a very close tie with the rise of social history and the Annales School in the 60s and 70s. I think the other interesting and exciting aspect of book history is that it's a very young and interdisciplinary field. So if you go to a book history conference, basically, everyone in the room would come from various different sub-disciplines of history, as well as the study of literature or economics, whatnot. This is my way of positioning myself, and also in this sort of larger historical background. And I also want to acknowledge, right, this discussion so far is very Western centric, and I think ultimately that is, because I'm the one invited, and this happened again. I happen to be my educational background. Um, I moved to the U.S. as a teenager, so most of my formative education and professional training took place in a Euro-American context. I'm sure as part of the initiative, our organizers will invite speakers who entered into the study of history from a different trajectory, and I think that's it's very important for us to get to know all of these different perspectives. And that, if I can change the slide, that ties into the next thing I want to say about the fact that history now has all these sub-disciplines. I think in conceptualizing what these different approaches to histories do, oftentimes we enter into a competitive or even a hegemonic discourse. But I think it's very important as historians that we think about reality as something that's far more complex than any of us can capture through our own scholarly and textual production. So this parable that I think a lot of us are familiar with, right? This parable of the blind man and the elephant. I think it's a very helpful way for me to think about historical research in this larger context, right? So each of us is just trying to shed light on one small aspect of this very complex reality, and it takes a collaboration among scholars from different training background and disciplines to try to illuminate the historical reality of the past. Okay, so that was my very short intro to subdisciplines. So now we'll turn to the central questions of today and next week's lecture, which is the notion of, or this movement that's often referred to as the linguistic turn, and then the way I relate to this in these two lectures, namely the question of word versus deed. Okay, so linguistic turn is a different way of thinking about how language or text relate to reality. It will become a little clearer later as well, right? Where instead of thinking about, say, a text as a passive reflection of reality, historians from this period start to think about it as a integral part of reality in one way or another. This movement is most strongly associated with what we might think of as the continental tradition, right? Most famously Foucault. But the focus of my lecture today is on the Anglophone tradition, the so-called Cambridge School historians whose interest in sort of this linguistic aspect of intellectual history is more grounded on the study of semantics and social linguistics, and they're interested in thinking about intellectual history as this interaction or even contestation of different actors, agents playing the same language game, or even playing different language games that are then interacting with each other. So as more specifically to characterize intellectual history as part of this linguistic turn, the emphasis, I guess maybe counterintuitively, is that it's about thinking about language in social context, or in context generally, rather than in sort of in this a priori way, in abstract. So I really particularly liked Annabelle Brett's account of this historical movement, and especially the way she emphasizes that historians from this period start to reckon or emphasize the plurality, instability, and promiscuity of text, which I think you will see is more concretely in my case study. And then finally, by approaching intellectual history this way, it widens the scope of what's addressed by intellectual history. It's no longer limited to elite discourse. So today's lecture, again, is going to focus on the Anglophone tradition, specifically the Cambridge School. And then next week's lecture, we're going to turn to a strand of linguistic turn that's more part of the continental tradition, so which is referred to in English as conceptual history or Begriffsgeschichte, right? But the specific case studies will be on early Chinese texts. So then now we're turning to the word versus deed issue. Sorry, it was supposed to show one at a time, but I guess I didn't do this build correctly. So this notion of word versus deed is a central antithesis or dichotomy in Western classical discourse, right? Especially in ancient Greek discourse. But I think it's obviously also a major concern for historians, ancient and modern. So we see, for instance, this dichotomy playing a major role in Thucydides. And I think we can recognize a similar dynamic in Shiji as well, in this kind of dichotomy that's word versus deed or yan versus xing. Although this is articulated not just through these two terms. Owen's article is a good example, that's on my slide, is a good example of a work that explores this dynamic. And in the two lectures, I specifically think about this dichotomy in the following two terms. So textual record versus historical reality, word versus deed. And then the issue of time, which I'll explain a bit, is in some ways also a word versus deed issue. So I would say, right, the relationship and oftentimes the conflict between textual record versus historical reality is an intrinsic aspect of negotiating these two things is an intrinsic aspect of historians' craft. I think most of us in learning to study the past, learning one way or another, what often might be referred to as source criticism, right? So which think about how closely can you use textual sources as a reflection of a historical reality that you're trying to understand, right? And so the question of when this text is dated to, whether it's authentic or not, and so on. And of course, that has strong parallels in the Chinese tradition as well. For instance, in culture or evidential learning. So that was one way of thinking about this relationship between word and deed. And I think time is another really interesting aspect of this dichotomy. So history is very much one of the maybe field disciplines that's dedicated to the study of time, right? When you think about what historians try to do in a very basic sense, right? We try to establish chronology, sequence of event and causation. Also, we're very interested in the dynamics between persistence and change, which are all things that takes place in time. But time is also a very complicated thing. I don't know, can you even call it a thing, right? And the fact that I don't even know what to call it, it articulates its ontological difficulty. So a lot of the philosophical paradox in, say, both the Greco-Roman tradition, the Chinese tradition, I think you can see them as sort of wrestling with how to think about time and almost all the paradox that time can generate. And to make things more complicated, not only is time a source of ontological difficulty, I think text, which might at first feels like a very simple thing, it's also a very ontologically complex entity, and it has a especially in terms of its relationship with time, which again I hope they'll become clearer once they go into the concrete example. But this might already become more apparent when we think about how we typically think about text, right, as a way to manipulate time, right? We commit things to words so that we have access to it in a future moment. I wrote the note down today so that I can see it tomorrow. So this might be a rather silly example, but I hope you're all somewhat familiar with this movie, The Groundhog Day, where Bill Murray is trapped in the same day, right? He'll wake up and it's Groundhog Day again, and he'll go through the same sequence of event again and again. And I always thought if I were to find myself in that situation, I think like maybe most of us would do, like we can just go to a library and then we can just read a different part of the book each of these days. And then so that's an easy way to deal with the fact that you're otherwise just experiencing the same day over and over again, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say with this silly example is that so in this movie you have a sequence of events, right? A beat, people's actions, that's all time bound. But text is something that introduces this fluidity and flexibility within time. So when we think about the relationship between textual record and historical reality, I think part of the dynamic is this complex relationship that text has with time. Okay, so to sum up, the two lectures today and tomorrow will deal with, will be centered on this historical development in intellectual history from the 80s and 90s, the linguistic turn, right? And I'm the anchoring topic for me is this relationship between word and deed with respect to both sort of historical record and reality and then the issue of time. Okay, so now we're going to move into case study. And I'm really sorry, but I realized I don't have a timekeeping device. Okay, okay, I think we're sort of fine. So as I mentioned, the biography of Sun Wu, the putative author of the famous Art of War, is the central case study today. And I will start by introducing this text and the problem of its relationship with the historical, the problem of its historical veracity that has been a major source of scholarly debate. And then I will show how in thinking about these this text through the Cambridge Schools lens, right, in thinking about it as speech act, how that changes, gives us an alternative way of thinking about this text. So before getting into all of that, I thought I'd just give everyone a very quick introduction to what's been happening in the study of Chinese intellectual history, just so that we're all on the same page. So I would say we're undergoing something like a paradigm shift in the recent decade. And if we were to characterize it briefly, it is to recognize the role of the early imperial period, which includes the Qing and the Han Dynasty, its role in as almost like this bottleneck, right? That's what my diagram is trying to show, or this filter for how we think about the history before the imperial period, the pre-imperial period, and the way the imperial period, the early imperial period, shaped the transmission of knowledge is integral to this process of transformation of these from, what we might call before unification, right? Basically this process of empire formation. So to put it very crudely, right, before this paradigm shift, the way we narrate pre-imperial intellectual history is basically this procession of thinkers and authors and masters, right, like Confucius, Mencius, Lao Tzu, and so on. And then as part of what instigated this this paradigm shift is the recent decades manuscript discoveries. And these discoveries, I think, confirmed what some scholars have already noticed just by looking at the received corpus, namely that instead of thinking of this as a neat history of just author after author, that the pre-imperial period, textual production in the pre-imperial period is more like this circulation of all these texts that are in many ways in flux, right? These independently circulating building blocks of text that are that could be as small as a saying or anecdote, or something bigger like a chapter of text that are all independently circulating and mutating. And then it's really during the early imperial period that these texts are finalized as the compilations that constitute our received corpus. And in my presentation today, I would suggest that Sima Qian's Shiji is an integral part of this process of textual transformation. And also, just to make sure we're all on the same page, right? The Shiji is the first, as I mentioned, often thought of as the first authored major historiographical work in the Chinese tradition, and a structures history largely in this biographically centered way, and which and its subsections became a model for the subsequent dynastic histories that are very important for anyone working on Chinese history. And if we think about what historical writing before Sima Qian is like, just to very roughly generalize, right? We have almost two types of text. One is the annals, such as one of the 5 classics, the Spring and Autumn Annals. And then in addition to these kind of annalistic writing, we also have just a lot of anecdotal writings, which actually Sima Qian called these anecdotal writings also 春秋. So it becomes a little confusing, but such as the 左传 or 三国策, and in a lot of ways, Shiji integrated and combined these two types of historiographical writings. Okay, so now we're turning to our case study, the biography of Sun Wu, which is found in this chapter 65, the biographies of Sun Zi and Wu Qi. This chapter contains the biography of 3 figures. The person we're going to focus, the maybe existing person we're going to focus on, Sun Wu, who's a figure traditionally dated to the late spring and autumn period, and then Sun Bing of the Warring States period, as well as Wu Qi of the Warring States period. And the biography of Sun Wu is really just the brief opening part of this biography, of this chapter, And it really just contains one story where Sun Wu basically is having an audience with the king of Wu, King He Lü, and he presents his what this text referred to as his art of war, Bing Fa. And then the king asks if he can show the efficacy of his military art. So then I think many of you know this story, right? He was asked to show that he can use this to turn the king's harem into a army. So then, of course, then he tries to make the harem ladies to follow orders, and they were just laughing and not following orders. Then in this very sort of legalistic manner, Sun Wu ordered the execution of the king's two favorite consorts. And the king was very distraught, but Sun Wu told the king, right, you no longer have authority over me now that I'm a commander of the army. And then the two consorts were executed, and then everyone was following orders. Then after this anecdote, we're briefly told of the military victories that are achieved by the state of Wu as a result of following Sun Wu's leadership. There are other versions of this account that I also talk about in this talk. One is a excavated version that, from, sorry, that should be mid 2nd century CE. So basically, you might say it's slightly earlier than Shiji, from the Yinqueshan tomb. So this manuscript cache, which is archaeologically excavated, contains a parallel version of the received Sun Zi Bing Fa, but also other texts that's no longer part of the received tradition. It also has a text that editors are labeled as Sun Bing Bing Fa, which doesn't have received counterpart. So the Yinshishan manuscript contains a version of the consort training anecdote I just mentioned. Another version of this consort training story can be found in the Spring and Autumn Annals of Wen Yue, which is a text that's could be composed in some form anywhere between the later Han and sometime during the medieval period. Both this story and the very notion of a spring and autumn period, Sun Wu has been very much suspected as something that's fictional. I mean, obviously the story itself has all sorts of folklore and fairy tale qualities. So even scholars from the Song period start to point out that if Sun Wu was such an important figure, it's very questionable that none of the pre-Han sources, such as Zuozhuan or Guoyu, mention him. There's really only his name really only started to pop up during the Han period, and then we had a major debate about this around the turn of the 20th century, and then this debate is revived after the excavation of the Yinqueshan materials in 1972. I thought Li Ling's argument is pretty definitive in a lot of ways, right? In showing that this is a text that's very unlikely to be written by someone from the spring and autumn period because of its intellectual content and vocabulary, but especially because of the kind of warfare that the art of war is concerned with, which is this infantry warfare, which is very different from the spring autumn period's warfare that's centered around chariot fighting. So what I would like to talk about next is how do we use the linguistic turn approach to history as offering an alternative to the question of whether the story is true or not, right? But instead, what we can think about is then what does this story do in its historical context? So then I'll take a brief detour and then talk a bit more about what exactly are these Cambridge School people. So historians most famously associated with the so-called Cambridge School are Quentin Skinner, J.G.A. Pocock, and so on. They emphasize reading intellectual discourse as speech acts. Okay, so just I think most of you are probably familiar with this concept, but just to make sure we're on the same page, right? So it's about thinking about text once again not as a description of reality, but as a action in itself, right? It's a way to change reality. So for instance, when we have a utterance, like if I were to say it is cold in here, right, there is a descriptive aspect of it, right? That's its elocutionary meaning, its propositional meaning, right? The temperature that describes the temperature of this room. But when I say this statement, very often I'm not trying to just describe this room, right? I have a some kind of intention behind it. That's what's referred to as the elocutionary aspect of this utterance, and that's tied to the speaker's intent, right? So I'm probably saying this because I want to change the temperature of this room in some ways. And then the perlocutionary aspect of this utterance focus on the possible effect of this utterance, right? So if I say it in a room with a thermostat, maybe I'm hoping someone would turn up the thermostat, right? Whereas if I'm saying this in a room where a window is open, maybe I'm hoping someone would close the window, right? So how exactly I'm hoping the reality would be changed is different depending on the context. So as you can see, understanding the meaning and significance of speech acts is very you can only understand it when you understand the context in which it is uttered. So Cambridge School historians, right, when they say read the work of Machiavelli and its reception history, they're no longer just concerned with what is its text, what is propositional meaning and what's the reality it's describing, but they're asking, so how is a work like this trying to transform reality in one way or another? So I framed our lectures in the sort of against this much older approach to history. That's, maybe we think of it as the archival term of the 19th century. But for the Cambridge School historians, their more immediate interlocutor is someone like Arthur Lovejoy, who proposed this idea of history of ideas, right, which analyze sort of a idea, such as in Lovejoy's case, right, he talked about this idea, there is this sort of great chain of being, and then how this idea manifests itself throughout history, and can be recombined with other ideas, but it's very much thinking about ideas as almost this independently existing entity that can travel through history, but the idea itself sort of remains intact. Okay, so now we come back to our case study and talk about how we think about this biography as a speech act in its historical context. Okay, so we can do this by reading the beginning of this text. So Master Sun, oh, sorry, I'm having a hard time seeing the slide, and so maybe we'll do this for a second because I can't see all of the text. otherwise. So Master Sun Wu was a man from Qi. He was summoned to an audience with the king of Wu on account of his art of war. Should we apologize? So the king He Lu said, there are certain chapters referring to the art of war. I've perused them all, I've read them all. Can we apply them to a little military exercise? Okay, so even with just this very beginning of this beginning part, right, there's a lot of questions. The text that you see on the right is taken from this Kaozheng scholar Liang Yusheng's 史记质疑. And as you can see there, he shows that not every text think of Sun Wu or Master Sun as men from Qi. In fact, the other sources, two sources he cites, associate Sun Wu with the state of Wu, so he's native to the state of Wu. So instead of asking, right, so if we think of text as reflections of reality, then our question would be, okay, well, where is he from, right? One of these two propositions is true, but we can instead ask, so what does it do to associate Sun Wu with Qi versus Chu, right? So then I think this is very clear in the Shiji context, that by arguing that Sun Wu, even though he's part of a Wu legend, is in fact from the state of Qi, then we form a lineage with the next figure that's going to be addressed in the same biography, right? Sun Bing, who is a military strategist of the Qi state. And this is the desire to associate these two figures is not just limited to Shiji. We sort of recognize the same, potentially the same, we might say, argument among the Yinshuan manuscripts, because we have this fragment that says probably, right, the work of the Sun lineage was illuminated in Wu and Yue, but put into words in Qi, saying whoever understands the way of the Sun lineage would surely complement heaven and earth, the Sun lineage, so on and so on. So in the Yinshuan manuscript context, this fragment like this, we can sort of guess, even though we can't place it with any of the more fully formed, fully reconstructed manuscripts. It makes sense to see it as part of the corpus, because in this corpus contains both the work of Sun Wu and Sun Bing, right? So there is some kind of, I would think of this as a paratextual utterance of material that's then trying to connect these two corpus. And then something that I can't fully explain in full detail here, but what I'm hoping to argue in both my first book and a subsequent book is that Shiji is part of this discourse from the Warring States and early imperial period that's trying to shape textual reality and intellectual reality, reshape textual reality and intellectual reality in some ways. Namely, they transform text from something that's more akin to a fluid and ongoing process, something that's more similar to water or mushroom. I can explain this more if you're interested, into something that's more individuated and time bound, something that's more like an object. So much like a time capsule, or really more akin to human individuals. So I would argue a large part of Shiji is part of this effort to transform textual reality. So then this requires another slight digression. Again, right, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So the notion of paratext is an important part of my work, as Avital has mentioned. paratext, as Gerard Genet, I think, has very insightfully argued, is another form of speech act. So it's not so paratexts are text that surrounds the main text, right? So everything from the title of the book, the author name, to something like the preface, or even the date that's associated with the text. So for instance, when we have, say this is one of the latest translations of the Odyssey, very few scholars today would think of the Odyssey as a work of a historical figure named Homer, right? So what's the function of Homer there? I would say in some ways we can think of it as a plea or a command to say, please think of this work as something that's associated with this name Homer in some ways. So how does that change reality? So among other things, then we would read this text as something that's related to this other text that's also associated with this name, right? Namely the Iliad. So suddenly you're reading these two texts as if there's some kind of relationship between them. And then, if we think about something like a preface, the preface is often asking you to read a text in a specific way, right? And that's not necessarily the true way of reading a text or the only way of reading a text, but it's a set of instruction from the producers of the text to the reader or the audience. So, if you read Genet's work, pretty much on page 1 or 2, he talks about how manuscript texts often don't seem to have any kind of paratextual markers, right? They don't have titles, author's name, they don't have anything like a preface. So part of what I'd like to suggest is that there's in fact no reason to think why manuscript paratext would look like paratext in print context, right? Which is what we're more accustomed to. So I basically proposed here a set of characteristics and criteria for thinking about what do paratexts do instead of what they look like. And then we find the things in the manuscript context that also perform these kind of functions. So as part of the, then what results from that is like, not only would I like to argue that a lot of these sort of narrative and other types of form of textual elements in early texts are paratextual. We also find that these kind of paratextual materials tend to have a parallel in 史记, and I think that underscores that that the 史记is, I think, just as much concerned with what might be called a history of a text than as history of people. So just to give you a concrete example, okay, so we have the consort training narrative in the Yinqueshan manuscript corpus is fragmented, so we don't know how it begins. So in the reconstructed text, we don't have this mention of the 13 chapters that we see in the 史记 version, but we do have 2 pieces of fragments that mentions the 13 chapters and seem to be saying something about the function of the 13 chapters, right? So this phrase 13 chapters was an alternative way of referring to the art of war or 兵法, and in fact it seemed to be a earlier way of referring to this text. So the earliest possible sources all call it 13 chapters. So then if you look at this 史记 passage in the very beginning, right? So the king says, I've read your 13 chapters. So this phrase appears in both the 史记 version and the Yinqueshan version, but there is no mention of this 13 chapters at all in the 吴越春秋 version. So I would like to suggest, right, that the fact that 史记 and Yinqueshan version share this concern with the 13 chapters reveals their sort of bibliographical and paratextual concern. They're interested in describing and prescribing how we should think about these 13 chapters. In fact, I would argue that they are trying to transform this more vague 13 chapters that's more like an anonymous text that's just been floating around into something that's like more like an individuated time-bound object by associating it with a with a figure that allegedly lived around the 500 BCE, right? So by doing that, if it's a text that's just certain chapters that by an anonymous person, it could be written at any time, right? But once we say, oh, it's the work of this person that lived during the time of King Wu Lü, right? So King He Lü, then we're locating this text in this specific historical context. I think you can see Shi Ji's concern with locating text in time throughout the compilation. So here I just have this example from the Annals of Zhou, from Shi Ji, where you can see, for instance, in this passage on the early period of King Cheng and Duke of Zhou. So all the things that has the purple line next to it are titles, and they all seem to be titles of the Shangshu material. And it's very much trying to locate all these texts in specific historical moment, right? Interweave it into part of the historical account. So I would say we can also see that the paratextual materials in Queshan is doing something similar. It's also trying to transform, sort of a set of manuscripts that might not have clear demarcated boundaries of, say, where this text begin or end, into something that's individuated with defined boundaries. So I might have to try to just describe this very briefly. So basically the question is, if you see just a bunch of manuscripts, like how do you know what part of it, which of them belong to one text as opposed to another text, right? So with a modern book, the paratextual elements such as the book cover, the binding is what tells you that, right? But basically what I wanted to show is that paratextual elements such as references to authors and their interlocutors is a way of separating texts into larger units. So for instance, the texts that are attributed to the Sun people are, they all have Master Sun Says associated with them. And then of course, then how do you know, are we talking about Sun Wu or Sun Bing? So that's where the interlocutor as another paratextual element become important, right? It's through which king they're speaking to that we know which of the Sun figure that we're talking about, and then therefore whether this text belongs to this pile or this pile. And I think this is very neatly illustrated by the publication history of the Queshan material. So the first edition for the Sun Bing's Art of War actually includes 15 additional chapters. So again, right, Sun Bing's Art of War doesn't have a received parallel. And then in the second edition, which is the edition that we mostly use, these 15 chapters became anonymous. So what's the difference between these 15 chapters versus the one that are still included in the Sun Bing corpus? They don't have the paratextual marker of Master Sun Says. So then when we look at this two group of texts, so the title that are in red, bright red, are a more extensive narrative. So you can see there's one extensive narrative associated with each pile. So the Jian Wu Wang, or an audience with King of Wu, that's the one that's a textual parallel to the Shi Ji biography. And then we can very much think of it as a, we can we read this story, not so much as a story that's just simply not historically true, but a story that's trying to tell its audience or readers something about what this text is about, right? So in the in Qiushan version, Master Sun says in his conversation with the king that warfare is a matter of state's interest, not that of pleasure. Warfare is not a game. Whatever lords and kings desire can be applied to the nobles, the lowly, or women alike, right? So I think this phrase, first of all, explains why it's a story about training women, right? So it itself is argument for the universal efficacy of the content, right, of the text of the art of war. If the story is the paratext, right? So the main text is the art of war. So it's saying that this text, what it teaches is so efficacious, you can even use it to train women. So again, right? So it also mentions that warfare is not a game or for pleasure, but it's a matter of state interest. So it says that because the king very much thought of warfare as fun and game, right? But this opposition is another way for us to think about the anachronistic setting of the story, because this notion of war, a more elite ritualized game, this conception of warfare is, I think, more closely tied to the spring and autumn period, and it's how the chariot warfare works, right? Whereas war as this brutal matter of state interest, we very much see it as part of warring states history. So in some ways, right, the Sun Wu's training of the consort is also the training of the king himself, right, who is transformed from a spring and autumn warrior into a warring states ruler who can lead a successful army, infantry. And it's similarly also an instruction for the audience, right? So in case you hold a more old-fashioned way of thinking about warfare, this is telling you we're not thinking about this in the spring and autumn way, right? This is an introduction to how warfare works in the Warring States period. So I think we can similarly think about all the various ways that this narrative in the Shiji account, what it's doing in the context of Shiji. So very brief conclusion. So going back to the central dichotomy of word versus deed. So if we're talking about this dichotomy between or this complex relationship between textual record versus historical reality, this Cambridge School approach or this notion of speech spec is basically saying that word is deed, right? So there's no longer this separation between the two. And then in terms of how we think about the relationship between text and time, the Cambridge School argument is very clear that, right, we can only understand any utterance or discourse as part of a historical context. So this is definitely a very useful notion, but it also creates almost this intellectual difficulty or paradox. So basically in the Cambridge School universe, right, history became these sort of layers of cake where, I mean, first of all, how do you define what the context is, right? So that's the problem. And then within this layer, however you define it, you can understand what all the utterance are trying to do, but then how do you move from this layer to the next layer, right? So that's very unclear or almost prohibited. So we have, for instance, Peter Gordon's critique of this approach as something that basically turns the universe into this monad where you can't, time is an illusion almost. You in fact cannot move across time. So next week's lecture on conceptual history is in fact all about this alternative way of thinking about the relationship between words and reality that's very much focused on diachronic movement and historical change. So I can conclude my today's presentation here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much for this wonderful talk. And you said you did not have a timekeeping measure. And I have to say, this is very impressive because it's been an hour and 3 minutes.
Thank you. My mom, she eventually decided to work again. It was like not showing, but this, yeah.
Really, really wonderful. So thank you very much. So we now open the floor to questions. And just as a reminder, you can raise your virtual hand or you can type your question in the chat box. If you do not wish to read your question yourself, you can also type the words, please read before your question, and I will read it on your behalf. So you're welcome to ask any questions that you have now. Yeah, following Madalena, you can now share the video. So if you all want to show our speaker your faces, I'm assuming it's a bit difficult to speak to a screen full of black squares, but so whoever wants to share your face, you're very welcome. I actually have a question, if I may. You're now muted, you know that, yeah?
Oh, okay.
So basically, if text, I really like this. I'm unfortunately not familiar with the methodological. I've only just started looking into the methodological aspects of historiography and what it means, and what does it mean to be a historiographer. And but I have looked into texts as living things, and the notion of text as an act, as a speech act, or as any kind of act that is ongoing, that has a life of its own, is something that really intrigues me. And my question is, if text equals act, perhaps historiography is not just, as maybe we used to see it, the writing of history, or used to be thought of as studying text or writing the history. Maybe it's an active participation in the historical act. So my question, I guess, is what is the relationship between us as historians and the historical text? That's one question. And can we still see historiography as a textual discipline, or is this whole paradigm shifting itself? Are we, because we're now working with texts that we perceive as objects? So I guess these are my questions. I hope they're clear. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I think I got the first question, but as I was writing it down, I think I might have missed was there a second question there as well, or?
Yes, so the first question is, yes, so the relationship between us as historians and the text. And the second one is, can we see historiography as a textual discipline, which also concerns the first question, or the whole notion of text as act.
Thank you so much. And these are excellent questions that allow me to talk about the things I want to talk about. And also, like, I would love to continue this conversation knowing that you work on music. And so I'm also very interested in how a historian of musicology would think about sort of ongoing processes. So I would very much say that, what this trying to articulate these ideas in trying to write these two books have led me to realize is that the way I was talking about how people like Sima Qian transformed the mode of existence of a text, right? And our scholarship is very much doing the same thing most of the times, right? So for instance, you know, say an excavated manuscript from Guodian, you know, the text that we modern editors entitled 穷大一时, I guess poverty and success depends on time. So in its original context, it's a text that doesn't have titles, right? And it very much is a text that you can think of as part of an ongoing process, right? Because we see parallel versions of it throughout the received corpus. They're all different, but they're also clearly related, right? So you can see each one of them as a snapshot of this ongoing process. But as soon as it's published as part of a modern manuscript facsimile, it now basically became an individuated text, right? Because now it has a title that we, you know, when we say 穷大一时, everyone knows what's the text that we're pointing at, right? Whereas that's not how it existed in its native environment, right? This become, I think the fact that it's very hard to talk about things that are non-individuated shows how you know, that the fact that the very fact we're trying to talk about these things through language transforms how they exist, right? So it's almost like there was a thing that was really part of a river. Modern scholarship has now frozen this river and then segmented it, so we can refer to the droplets in each segment in this very specific way, right? So that is very much a way of transforming reality. And I think, you know, historiography is, you know, if you know, this might be overgeneralizing, right? But history writing as a process is often about transforming a reality that's ongoing and very messy, like a mushroom, into some kind of linear process that's more like a sequence of time capsules, right? So there is a fundamental way that historiography as a textual enterprise is always transforming reality, I would say.
Thank you so much. And I would definitely love to have these discussions with you, but history as an act versus text as an act, and how we combine the two things. But that's for later on. We have Professor Richter who would like to ask a question. So would you please, oh, are you unmuted? Oh. Yeah, you're unmuted already.
Yeah, thanks. Unmuted myself. I'm a bit hesitant. Well, first, nice to see you all. But so, Heng, would you just tell me if you just answered that question and I just didn't notice? That's possible. So, because I'm slow in thinking, but a thought that I formed maybe while you were speaking was, so if we see a text as a speech act at a particular point of time, and then for us, we're trying to understand that speech act in its particular context. And I think context was one thing you mentioned. Maybe that's also jumping ahead to next week. I don't know that either. But the question that came up in me is, if I'm performing a speech act, I'm also doing it in a context, and I also have a sense of that context, right? Mm-hmm. Like the window is open, thermostat, or whatever the example is. Mm-hmm. And then today, in other words, someone later in history trying to understand that speech act in its context, how do we now, as the ones who look from a later point, how do we take care of the difference between what the context appears to be now, as compared with what the context appeared to the people then? So put very simply, if you just take time, you know, when I'm Sima Qian or so, I'm at the end point of the time describing, you know, from whatever the start is to where I'm sitting now, right? But we see the same segment of time in this much larger context as this particular stretch of time. Mm-hmm. And the same probably goes for space, and space in some well, context, I'm sorry, has sometimes bothered me even more, right? It's very hard for me, who am so used to seeing, let's say, true, where now most of the manuscripts come from, as this particular spot or extension of space in a much greater context that I am a little bit familiar with, having traveled in China from Beijing to Guangdong, for example. So I have this different sense of extensions, right? And I cannot help somehow always seeing the space this way. So my question, I guess, is, do people who address that and formulate more sophisticated thought than I do about speech acts, do they have means of taking care of this difference? Was that even a clear question?
I think I understood, but definitely just like interrupt me and let me know if I'm not at all, yeah, going anywhere near the ballpark. I mean, I guess part of this is sort of the fundamental difficulty of working on the past, right? Like there's all this or like we can only try our best to exit our world and find the world, or get rid of our plan, like the way we conceptualize what was one's context spatially and temporally, and try to understand what was that for them. But that in itself is inherent difficulty, just as any other aspects of trying to reconstruct the past. I would say, so I think maybe part of it is maybe we can turn to probably the works of what we think of as like now school people who are concerned with concepts such as mentality, right? So they're more concerned of understanding so in a given historical concept, how they think about the environment at large, right? So like what might be the shared notion, say, of what's true, or what's considered part of the same context or same time period, right? What was past for Sima Qian, right? Like what was recent and distant for him, for instance. And then I think, if I understood your question correctly, I think it also sort of touches upon this inherent this debate that I see surrounding the linguistic turn between like what we might think of as the Anglophone tradition versus the continental tradition, where the Anglophone tradition wants to emphasize more that there is an agency to the speaker, right? So the speaker has an intention that's and we can reconstruct that intention that's reacting to the speaker's immediate context, or what the speaker considers as these layers of different contexts, right? Whereas, people like Foucault would want to say there isn't really such a thing as an individual intention, right? So what we can reconstruct is more of this mentality, or this larger way of, what a person, say, from 2nd century BCE might reasonably say or do, so you almost cannot go into this more fine-grained defined context, and an individual person's intention within that. And I guess in terms of how I think about this, I just feel like my takeaway from all of this is that our work would just make more sense if we just clearly define what's our argument vis-a-vis what, right? Like, am I talking about the 5 people or the 2 people who might be seeing this manuscript after it was produced for the first time, or am I talking about how a person from this true region during 3rd century BCE would reasonably, what's the meaning of the text they would infer, versus how a person from the Han period would read it, right? So like if we are specific about what the context is, then then our work just is more meaningful. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, a little bit, it's sort of an endless question. I was I was mainly interested in if the scholarship on that, when they use things like context ideas like this, if they talk about that. I should have been clearer maybe in one example that occurred to me is, for example, I don't know if it's a good one. So if in true, there is stuff that we see now, oh, they participate in the mainstream Northern culture, right? And I guess my question is, when as a speech act, someone who in true writes something and Kunze is mentioned or so, right? Or the Shi, were they assuming, we are using the authority of the glorious Northern mainstream culture, or were they doing something more like, well, we are the glorious mainstream culture, of course, and we're like your world music, I'm using an African instrument in my band, So these strike me really as the tricky questions, when we work with that material.
Yeah. I think, I guess that's they would, people who think about these questions would say that, that's something we're trying to reconstruct, right? By maybe looking at other, like if we can deduce what's the language game, right? I guess another thing that's important to the Cambridge school discourse is the Wittgenstein's language game idea, right? So we can only understand what a utterance is doing if we understand the game, right? So if we can look at all of these texts and see if we can possibly identify a pattern, right? Whether it's about showing our affiliation with the North versus almost appropriating the North, right? And then we were deducing what's the rule of the game in this case. But so theoretically, that's a way of thinking about it, but practically it's very difficult to do. So yeah.
Thank you, Professor Richter. You just reminded me another anecdote from the Shiji, which is the dialogue between Li Si and the first emperor before he became emperor, who wants to only enable things from Qin to be included in the court. I don't know if you remember this one. And then Li Si admonishes him that if he did so, then the ladies from Zheng and Wei and the odes and everything that we see as being kind of in odds with one another, apparently is all under the context of foreign influences within the court of Qin. So it's a really kind of what you said threw me to this dialogue in a sense. Sorry for bursting into the conversation. So we have another question from Madalena. Can you ask your question, please?
Yes, it's kind of a series of questions because I want to make sure I understood correctly. It's mainly scholarship that I'm not familiar. I mean, everybody has heard of the Speech Act, right? When you actually have to understand what it is, it becomes a bit different. So you gave the example of the fact for the one of the last examples. I don't remember how you translated the title, but the Shiji was telling us that there are 13 chapters in the work he's referring to, right? And this information is missing from another source that also refers to the same work, right? And you're saying, well, that's basically the Shiji telling us how to read the text. Is that correct? Right. So my question there is, why is it not just what Sima Qian was looking at? So the Shiji became very famous at one point because they found all this material from the Shang dynasty, so all the way, dated to the Shang dynasty. And there was this list of kings that matched almost identically. So it was this moment when people started saying, oh, okay, wow, the Shiji actually was true. Whether or not it was what's saying was true, that's a different story. But it was clearly looking at documents that were replicating the list of kings. And therefore you can say, well, to Sima Qian, maybe what he was just doing was replicating truth. Is not, what to him was historical accuracy. It wasn't telling anyone else how to read or to think of the past. So why can it not be that way? And in relation to that, you also mentioned, in fact, the Jiangtai as an example of, well, now it has a title, it is, presented in a certain way, it is transcribed into modern Chinese, so to speak. And it didn't have that all the way when it was produced. And again, there, I think what you call this way of sort of prescribing how to read or to think of a text, could it not just be a sort of pragmatic way to fill in information that we don't have, and the Sima Chen didn't have, or the other people didn't have? That's my question.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
So how to distinguish, I guess the real question is how to distinguish when someone is really doing a prescriptive work, and when someone is just saying, well, either this is what I have, or this is what I'm trying to fill in with the evidence that I have, which may not be 100% or may be wrong in the future, right? There may be new evidence that comes out. Is there a way to distinguish these?
Yeah. This is, I think this is like exactly things I wanted to talk about during the talk. And then, so I'm really glad, like I didn't think I had time. So thank you so much for asking. And it is a very complicated issue. So I might not start at the right place, but I mean, first of all, I don't think it's quite a dichotomy. And I think by saying something is prescriptive, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's making up entirely like a drastic break from existing reality, right? Like you're fabricating a new reality. You know, sometimes the act of prescription is to say, well, maybe you have multiple records, and you picked one, right? So I think I guess this is why I guess I started the talk with the elephant parable, right? I think actually reality for the most part are always multifaceted, and you know, and there are always multiple competing records, right? So even most of the times, you know, a lot of books have alternative titles, right? Like even modern books, like it might be first serialized as a newspaper under a different title, and then once they become a book, right? So you put a different title to it, and or kept the same title, right? And that act is you trying to shape or control reality in some ways. So I think, you know, and then in the specific case of the Sun Wu biography, right? So the reason I picked this as a case study is that I think there the argument is pretty strong that this cannot be a simple description of reality, right? Because the warfare it described is anachronistic to the warring states, to the spring and autumn period. So you just very unlikely to have a person from the turn of the 4th century. Did I do that right? Like from around 500 BCE, writing a text like that, right? So I think here, in a way, what this approach is nice is that what's nice about it is that then there's nothing that's false, right? In a way, we no longer have to worry about whether a text, you know, which part of Shiji is true, right? Instead, we're saying all of Shiji is true to his time in the sense that they're all doing something, right? So then so instead of trying to reconstruct, like trying to understand what's the how close can we get to the spring and autumn period through Shiji, right? We're asking what does this story tell us about Shiji's time? So in that sense, it's not a alternative, but it's a way of allowing us to make, I think, all historical records meaningful, right? Whereas if you use sort of the more traditional source criticism method, then really only a small select number of sources are meaningful in terms of our attempt to reconstruct history, right? And everything else is like degrees of truth are patently false. So then the question of so why, right? So why isn't that like these things I'm calling paratext? They're just simply writing down what people already knew as true, right? So Jeanette actually talks about this notion of implicit paratext, right? So I guess maybe one way to use maybe a simpler metaphor, right? Maybe people always thought, like everyone in ancient Greece just thought like these two things that they call the Iliad and the Odyssey are by this guy called Homer. And then at some point, this universally acknowledged truth is just written down, right? So the reason that, I increasingly come to, I guess I prefer not to have that as a assumption, like the assumption that the ancient readers just knew more, and then they, even without these paratextual materials, they know which text is by whom, right? Even if it's anonymous and so on. I mean, I'm sure that's the case sometimes, but I guess, like, I mean, the thought experiment I always do is like think about what we know and how we come to know it, right? The fact that you and I agree on certain set of knowledge is not a priori a state of things that just naturally exists, right? It's because of this very elaborate centralized information circulation system that we are part of, right? Through whether it's the library catalog and publishing system, or like our education system, right? And all of these things are to various degrees top-down controlled way that information is disseminated, right? As soon as there isn't such a top-down control, like look at our internet today, right? Then you no longer, this notion that there is this agreed upon truth, the way, like Sima Qian's records correspond to the Shang record, right? That falls apart. And you then start to have competing labels and descriptions to reality. So then basically my argument is that things can only become stabilized and individuated if they exist inside some kind of information system that has like a top-down control structure. So then, and Paratext is a manifestation basically of this information control structure. So then this then touches upon the question of how we would like to imagine the world of pre-imperial China or even early imperial China, right? Do we think everyone in the pre-imperial space shared some kind of top-down information control system, so that this text traveling from one part of land to another, even without titles and any kind of paratextual label, we just still know somehow that this is a text by Confucius or Mencius, right? And I think it's very clear that through the received corpus, that's probably, at least in a large part, not the case, right? Because of alternative attributions of a lot of the text, right? So it's things that scholars like Yu Jiaxi have argued for, right? And then the part of the knowledge, what did exist is some kind of process of canonization that basically then instates some kind of top-down information structure, right? So we can see there's degrees of difference, right? The what we think of as the Confucian classics, those there's more of a shared knowledge surrounding those materials earlier on compared to the other parts of the early Chinese corpus. So I guess this is sort of, I don't know if that made sense in terms of answering your question.
Yeah, I just think that, and this is, I want to leave time for the next speaker. But I also think there's a lot of accidents and accidental things that happen that then it's kind of adds on top of what you're saying, or by the side. I don't know how you want to picture in your head. That also could give sort of counterexamples to this logic, to this kind of analytical lens, in a sense, that you're trying to use. But I understand you're not claiming to make it for all existing text of the time. So I understand that. Yeah, I'll pass to you later.
Absolutely. And then also I would totally agree that in fact I think that the way I suspect we're sort of largely on the same page. It's just that I shift the emphasis or the assumption around, right? I think, for instance, like I think accident is the norm, right? So if you want to create coherence and continuity and correspondence, that requires some kind of effort, right? Work in the physics sense, right? That's so for instance, the correspondence between Sima Qian and the oracle bone materials could be evidence of some kind of, you know, continuous effort to keep record, right? But that whatever institution allowed that is itself a anti-entropic effort, right? That you know, that humans have to intentionally commit to it to make it happen. And so it's not how things happens by default, right? So by default, things are just mutating and changing because everyone needs to modify text according to what you need to do with it in a given context, among other things, right? And then also you made a mistake and so on. So yeah. Love to talk about it more.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. Let's give time to others too. Thank you.
Lovely. So we are running out of time, but we have one more question here from Danielle. So if you can unmute yourself.
Yes, sure. Thank you. So thanks for your talk. I have a question that is a bit more, well, close to the sources, I would say. So you mentioned that like the Sun Tzu Bingbai becomes a closed text when you're in the Shiji, and the anecdotes help situate it, you know, that about the court ladies fighting and all of that. So do you have any idea where these anecdotes come from? Where this paratextual material comes from that is used to frame the text? Is it from within the text in some cases? Is it existing anecdotes that get repurposed? Or is it just unknown to us? And I'm asking because I'm working on similar stuff, well, the reverse process, so to say, in the Qing dynasty, when the Kaozhang scholars start to unpack these texts and say, well, this doesn't belong here, this doesn't belong here, all of that. So I'm really curious to hear whether you have any idea of whether it's possible to tell where these materials come from in the first place, because Qing scholars, they fill in a lot of blanks, I should say. They add stuff on the tiniest bit of evidence, and lots of stuff starts to bloom. So I wonder if you can say something about that.
Thank you, and I'm very interested in, I'm becoming increasingly interested in how Qing scholars are reading these kind of materials. So I would look forward to your work. I mean, I think like with a lot of things, I really don't think we can really know the origin unless we have some kind of happy accident. So it's this like sort of Lao Tzu-esque concept of like things by the time we can detect them, right? It's already been, or you know, things in the beginning are just like way, right? Like, and we can't really detect them. I think that's sort of, there's sort of a historical truth to it. But I think so I guess what I was trying to say was the Shiji version, the Intishan version versus the Wu Yue Chunqiu version. And of course that it's my hypothesis, argument, and supposition, right? Like it's a speech act. It's not, I'm not saying we can prove it as historically true, but what we often can see with early Chinese materials is that you know, how people are adapting the same material for different purposes. So I think what's interesting to me is that I feel like Shiji, so not just with this story, but with other parts of the Shiji, you see this shared interest in describing text, right, and not just people, right? Whereas in contrast, I think the Wu Yue Chunqiu version is the way it is because Wu Yue Chunqiu as a text is more interested in telling stories than sort of having a meta discussion about text. Yeah, so in terms of where this very fascinating specific story come from, I think I at some point cited this article by Peterson. I think he might, I'm trying to remember if he also talked about other sort of narratological parallels to the story. but yeah, I don't have concrete guesses. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you very much. So I think we will stop here, but as Madalena has written in the chat box, you're welcome to email the organizers or Professor Du additional questions or post them to Twitter on In Sinology. I personally still don't have Twitter. I just realized I do need to have, because Sinology is a thing there. I want, please join me in thanking Professor Du very much for today's talk. Thank you very, very much. It was a wonderful talk. And we will convene next week, same time, same place or not, wherever you are, into the second talk of this series, which will deal with conceptual history. You can find the recommended reading for this session on the Methods in Sinology website, also linked here by Madalena in the chat box. And yeah, same virtual space, right? And again, once again, I wish to thank Heng Du for your wonderful presentation, and wish you all a good day or good night, depending on where you are on this crazy globe. So have a lovely whatever it is, and thank you for joining us today.
Many thanks for everyone, and to Avital, Madalena, and Mariana for organizing this.
Thank you for coming. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.